This podcast featuring SweepSouth CEO Aisha Pandor is brought to you by the BigFive Summit, Africa's leading small business technology event. The summit will take place 19th and 20th March in Cape Town. Hello and welcome to the Big5D podcast. I'm Charles Laughlin, joined by Aisha Pandor, CEO of SweepSouth. Aisha, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Charles.
It's a great pleasure to have you. And I just want to make a quick note before we get into the conversation that we're in the process of planning the BigFive Summit coming up in March in Cape Town. Aisha, you will be one of our speakers. We're going to do a fireside chat at the conference, and we really look forward to that. And we want to thank you for agreeing to join us at the summit. But let's get started on a conversation here today. SweepSouth is a company I've been very interested in, keeping an eye on for quite some time now. I believe he launched it in 2014. Is that right? So it's been not quite, well, this is your 10th year, right? So congratulations, I guess, on your decade anniversary. I'm not sure what your decaversary, or I guess we just made up a word. What my first question for you is, what was and I'm sure you've answered this 100 times, but please do so for me. What was the original impulse that led you to this? And then I think more interesting is why you thought sort of the gig approach. I'm not going to say Uber for XYZ because that's so played out, but I just said it. Just give us a little of the origin story, and then we'll carry on from there.
Yeah, so I mean, we had the idea in late 2013. I must say that we were already thinking about building something. You know, I had come from a background in genetics and then had worked in management consulting for a bit and had already resigned from my job and was sort of thinking about, you know, what is it that we're going to do next, and loved the idea of tech-enabled business. It had to be tech-enabled. It's sort of a personal belief that technology as a tool lends itself to more scalable, future relevant businesses.
So no restaurant. You weren't considering opening a restaurant.
No, unfortunately, which great industry potentially for someone else, but no.
Right.
And and we liked marketplaces, so two-sided marketplaces, because if you're able to build them well, they are defensible. They're hard to build. They're defensible, but there's upside for both sides.
Okay.
And so we had thought through different ideas in the space. We'd actually come up with a business called SweepSouth, which was tourism and a tourism marketplace, had put together a 60-page business plan for that business. And then I was like, well, I don't personally feel that passionate, to your point about restaurants, about tourism. I enjoy, traveling a bit and going to different countries,
Right.
but I don't really feel personally passionate about the industry. And so the idea for SweepSouth came as we were sort of pivoting from that idea, came out of a personal need where our nanny and helper went away on holiday and left us high and dry, actually during this time of the year, so sort of December, January holidays in South Africa. And because this was so top of mind, the idea of marketplaces, and we'd fairly recently gotten a Lyft ride. I think Uber had just launched in South Africa, but we'd taken a Lyft ride in San Francisco a year prior, maybe. And so it was kind of top of mind, and we thought it would be great to build something that on the one hand, and we don't like gig economy because it's sort of maybe sharing economy or a platform economy business. It does, create more sustainable work, I think, than a lot of these platforms. And then on the other hand, there was the impact side, which has been a theme that personally has also been very important to me. Is, there's the opportunity to create impactful work opportunities and professionalize this sort of work, bring many women into the sort of more formal working economy. And so that's how the idea came about. And we spent about 6 months building it and launched in just before June, I think the 30.
About a 6-month process of going through one idea and dispensing of it, and then coming up with the new idea.
Actually about 6 weeks coming up with an idea, putting together that business plan. I think that's where, having a doctorate comes in handy. You sort of
You're used to writing long form.
Yes, exactly. So putting together that business plan, which got canned. And then we spent about 6 months building the actual platform, getting the first customers on board, doing the onboarding. And in 2014 in South Africa, even things like setting up an online banking account and a way to accept payments online took took quite a bit of time and was very frustrating.
I kind of like to get to solving that problem perhaps later. So how many pages was this business plan? Did you go from 60 to 70 or from 60 down to 50?
I was business planned out by this point, and we
Were
worked
you
on a
cutting,
lean
were you
canvas.
search and replace? Uh,
Not even, it was so different that
uh-huh.
that we couldn't even do that. So it was this was we worked on a lean canvas model, which was also a good learning experience.
Okay.
Is there a quicker way to do this, and to sort of validate some of your key assumptions than drawing up a book basically,
Right.
before actually speaking to any real customers, potential customers.
You may said something that's kind of interesting, which kind of dovetails with what conversation I'm having with a lot of companies now, which is sort of going from that this notion of getting customers quickly in order to establish your business. That during sort of the frothy period where people were able to raise money so easily, that wasn't always the priority, but that was a priority from you from day one, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think just knowing that, and again, I think it's important that we always talk about, the initial business, because we haven't always done things right, and
Sure.
there've been a lot of learnings. But yeah, especially, the second time around, it was actually just get this in front of people, get validation, and particularly people who will be the sort of typical customer for this business, and you can get around a whole lot of like the pain and the making your own assumptions and stroking your own ego about building a business
Right.
that you want to build, as opposed to something that's going to be useful and valuable for people.
Sometimes it's too much about perfecting the product before you show it to anyone, right?
Absolutely.
Whereas, and I
Yeah,
think it's build the plane while you're flying sort of
yeah,
situation.
absolutely. Yeah.
Now, you mentioned impact, and I know that's a big component of what you're doing. The thing I've always been curious about, and I guess that curiosity clarified as you said this, was how have you improved the ability for your workers to monetize their time through
Yeah.
this platform versus what they were experiencing before the platform even existed?
Yeah, I mean, so prior to Sweep South existing, there wasn't a platform like this on the entire African continent. So it was the first time that the idea of connecting to home services workers in particular had been built into a product. And so the first thing was just around access to work. Prior to this, you either worked for an agency, you were referred, you maybe listed your services on a classifieds, online classifieds or newspaper classifieds, or you were referred by someone if you were lucky enough to have a network. My sister, my aunt works for someone, and maybe they
Right.
will refer me to someone else who's looking for work. Um, or you stood on the side of the road with a little piece of paper,
Wow.
advertising your services,
So
which is
have
an
you
incredibly.
prevented some pedestrian accidents as a result
Yeah,
of this?
so
Uh,
accidents, it's a
uh,
waste of people's time,
sure.
valuable time. It's not the most dignified way to find work. It's
Fair enough.
unsafe. So, all sorts of issues just around how you connect to work, how both sides are vetted. Sweep South has changed what payment rates are. So, 20% more that workers are getting paid in this industry versus the rest of the industry outside the platform. And again, there's a big piece around professionalizing this work. And I think, again, going back to technology as a
Mhm.
as a vehicle, if you've got a database where you're collecting information about performance, about earnings, not only can you be transparent about that to the public, but also this is something that didn't exist before in this industry, where there's good record of your work performance that's
Yeah.
objective. It's not subjective. My one employer whose house I work in, without anyone else being able to sort of vet, performance and all of that stuff. You're basically, before, your entire ability to get work was dependent on a person in a house, privately, and how they feel about you and your work, which is,
And
which is
now
not
it's the aggregation of all the work that you've done and how it's been
and
evaluated. Yeah.
absolutely, and two-sided and
Okay.
two-sided. So, in
Right.
as much as you are being rated, you're rating other people as well. And then, innovations like tipping, like, how scheduling works. We've, really been able to drive the amount of people who are upskilling themselves. So there's a high percentage. I think the last time the team checked, it was about 22% of people who are either doing some other work or who are studying, which is higher than the average outside of Sweep South. And so, yeah, a lot of work around, access to work, professionalizing the work, how you get paid for that work, it being treated as dignified work, and then how that also opens you up to other work opportunities
Yeah.
by allowing you time and flexibility, and also just doing professional work, so being part of the labor force, which drastically increases your chances of getting more
You
formalized work.
mentioned earnings have risen sort of on average for the workers on your platform. Is that talk about how that happened? Is that simply just because the users of your platform, the other side of the marketplace, are more willing to pay more for the convenience that the platform provide? Talk about why they're making more money.
There are a few things. So yes, absolutely that, that there's that the people are willing to pay more for the convenience. The second thing is that, if you're paying for a service and you know that there is vetting that's been done, you know that there's a team who can handle any complaints that may crop up or any issues that may crop up. If there is an event that's out of your control, like a public transport strike, or someone's child is sick and they're not able to go to work, that's going to be managed and a replacement found very quickly. All of those things are things that provide additional value and people are willing to pay for. And again, this is something that when we first launched, we had the sort of aspirational idea of what constitutes a good living wage. And we started off the platform with charging that rate, and it didn't work.
The
We had
market will
no
decide,
design.
right?
The market will decide. And so it
Yeah.
was this interesting sort of experience of going from this is what we think people should be paying and what the market should look like to, okay, we're going to have to take a few steps back, and we're going to have to build up value, build up that convenience, but also educate a market. And again, this is why transparency around, payment rates, lived and working and earning experiences has been so important as the company's matured. Because there's also a piece that's just educating people around, if you're paying a couple of thousand rands equivalent to someone a month, like what does that actually cover?
Hmm.
And how sustainable is that?
Yeah. Having had the conversation to this point, I think we could devote an hour simply to the subject of how this impacts the workers. But I want to talk about the business of Sweep South, so I'd like to pivot to another direction, if we may. And again, as we noted at the beginning, you've been around 10 years. Uh, the business has stayed sort of in the kind of category that it's in, which is, house cleaning or home services. Or what could talk a little bit about some of the decisions you've made and maybe some of the decisions you've not made in terms of where to take the business. How does Sweep South scale, I guess, just outside of what it started as?
Yeah, so very focused on home cleaning in particular in the early days, and part of that was just through the experience that we had as founders. And over time, we have really worked on a strategy that scales both in terms of other services, so outside of cleaning into a broad range of home services. And if you think about like all of the things that it would be helpful to have a platform help you
Hmm.
get done at home, there's a really wide range of things, from plumbing services to painting to something else breaks, handyman
Yeah.
tasks. There's a whole
That
range of things.
sounds like the same business, but it's really not, is it?
It really isn't. It really isn't. And although there are elements where there's
Sure.
a high rate of overlap, and then there's home care, so caring for children, caring for elderly. So there's quite a sort of big
That
basket of
feels like a more
opportunities.
natural adjacency, to be honest.
Absolutely, but also comes with a lot of risk, and
Yeah,
caring for
sure.
people versus caring
Yeah,
for.
people is one thing. Cleaning a carpet is quite another.
Yeah, and but pets, is also a really
That's a
interesting
sort of in
space.
between the two, right?
Exactly, exactly. So expect that to be coming within the next year or so from the
Hmm.
team, and then new geographies
Right.
is another big sort of opportunity for expansion.
Okay. So on that point, and again, if I get the dates wrong, don't hesitate to correct me at any point. But it was like a few years ago, like 2019 ish or 2020, 20. You correct me. You expanded into Nigeria and Kenya. I think part of what every startup does, we start in South Africa, we start in Kenya, whatever. Where are we going to go from here
Yeah,
geographically?
yeah,
It's a standard sort of decision point, right?
yeah.
Talk about the decision you made to go in, and as it's been widely publicized, you have retracted from those two markets. Could you just briefly walk us through the decision to go in, the decision to reverse that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, as you said, like many African South African companies, as part of this avenue of expansion in going into new geographies, we'd looked at what are the key markets on the continent, and what are the markets in which people face the same sort of challenges around access to help at home, and on a provider side, access to work opportunities where the technology and ops that we've built would be relevant. And we're really excited about going into these markets. Had great initial traction, and then in 2022 looked at where the market was heading, particularly in the second half of that year. And we're able to foresee the year that we've just had in 2023. And
Hmm.
although traction was great, looked at the amount that would be required to invest into these markets to really get things off the ground, and made the decision that, again, given both the VC funding climate, but also what things were looking like locally in some of those geographies, from a
So this was macro driven in a lot of
both
ways.
both. So things like the impact that the war in Ukraine has had on inflation in some of these markets,
Sure.
currency devaluations. And Nigeria experienced a big shock. Last
Did
year
this
post
impact demand? Did this impact the unit economics,
both
impact, et
both
cetera? Okay.
both and sort of forecasting out, right? At the time, everything was going great, but I think you don't look at the business today. You look at, again, what are opportunities for growth within the next year or two, and what is
Hmm.
it going to take to invest into that versus the return that we're going to get. And it didn't make sense to invest in sort of continued lower numbers versus an approach that looked at investing
So
in
you weren't
increasing
hitting your
in South Africa.
expectations
Yeah,
because
from an ROI point of view.
because of all the things you just mentioned.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. And I
So,
think those are really interesting markets still, and will be interesting markets for Sweep South in future. Um,
so it hasn't precluded you going back.
Absolutely not. Yeah, yeah.
Do you have a plan for that?
I mean, I think we'll see. What I've also been really interested in is a strategy that looks at a blend of, um, you know, markets on the continent and emerging markets either outside of the
Yeah,
African
I hear this a
continent.
lot. It's like not just Africa, but emerging markets.
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
that's always interesting. I mean, there's always, like Southeast Asia, Latin America, et cetera. That feels like a much bigger lift than just expanding into Kenya or Nigeria or name another adjacent country, perhaps. Um, is it? And just talk about that for a moment, kind of the decision factors that go into choosing which geographic markets to expand into, given that you've already kind of had one attempt that didn't work out the way you wanted it to.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because we have so Sweep South has a mix of South African, African, and US investors, and one of the comments that we hear quite a lot from our US investors in particular is that sometimes African companies don't realize how much you have to overcome to scale, and how much of an easier journey that could be in other markets. So different
Mm.
challenges for sure, but everything from the size of the market to price elasticity to the infrastructure that you have available, to partners that you can work with. So I think that's one consideration. And then the other thing is that we have operations in Egypt through the acquisition of Fulchedma, which is sort of Sweep South, Egypt's version of Sweep South,
Right.
and a lot of positive experiences and lots of learnings as well about that which is a sort of a more scaled business in a market which is very different. It's not sub-Saharan Africa. It's
It's
different language,
Saharan. It's,
very different culture.
yeah.
So
That said, it is on the continent, but and when people talk about the five countries in Africa that get most of the money, Egypt is one of them, right? So, um, I'm curious about how that acquisition unfolded, and then what your expectations were. Was it considered a sort of foot in the sand to expand into elsewhere in MENA, for example, or what was the plan, and what is the plan going now that you've had the company for a couple of years now? Correct me again.
Yeah, so it's been a few years. The conversation with Fulchedma started with speaking to the founder Omar during COVID, and sort of just, I guess, commiserating as founders about, like,
Sure.
how difficult it was going through the pandemic with a business that um, depends on people engaging together in a house, and these
Bringing
connections
face to people
happen
face to
face to
face.
face. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
And just talking about how we managed through that really difficult time, and then started talking more about what they were building over there and some of the products that had worked really well. A lot of B2B and B2B2C focus in that market. The seasonality is different. So yes, although it is the African continent, their winter happens at a completely different time
Right. It's
than
there's the
people.
equator gets in the way.
Yes, exactly, right? So you can leverage off of some of these differences. There's enough sort of commonality in that they're in the same space. There's
Hmm.
lots of sort of, as founders, we enjoyed engaging with each other, but there also were differences where we felt like the markets could enhance, complement each other.
Hmm.
And so that's played out really well. The B2B and B2C business there is doing really well. They've had interesting traction in verticals like beauty, and something that's not really common in South Africa is like air conditioning, and that as a really big industry, and that gearing up before the summer, because obviously our summers aren't as hot. And so
Yeah.
those things have worked really well, but also really challenging. Acquiring a business that's been around for a similar time, although it was much smaller size, and having to assimilate a team culturally, restructure an org to accommodate that, work from having two separate strategies that are sort of headed up by two different founders, and dovetail that into one that works and that people are happy with, was difficult, but
Those
it's
sound like
done.
difficult problems, to be honest.
Difficult
Uh,
problems, yeah, but
yeah.
also
Not so
feeling
much
really great
problems,
to
but
have gone through that.
just
Yeah,
steps that you have to
challenges to
take
get
to
around.
integrate. Right. Right. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I think
So,
it's a really, really interesting part of the company's maturity, and personally an experience that I'm super grateful for.
so when you looked at the two platforms before you made the acquisition, what were the major differences that you identified that you thought would be significant challenges to overcome in integration? And were those, in fact, the ones that were the biggest challenges? Because that's often those aren't the same once you've uh, started doing the work, right?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I'll talk about some of the things that we kind of highlighted as priorities, and then what was or was not really a priority. And I think so. One of the big things that came up was technical integration and the importance of streamlining, all of the tech work to try and get a single platform between the two businesses. That turned out to be important, but not as important as we thought, and probably also more difficult.
Right.
Again, considering that we had
Maybe
uh,
if you're scaling across more markets, that sort of platform integration would be more important.
exactly,
Mhm.
100%, yeah.
Mhm.
And also depending on what are the services, and how you're wanting to scale, and what is your strategy. But I think it was very evident that they built a platform that was well suited to that market, and culturally how people engage with these sorts of services. And it was working to a degree. And there's also, don't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are things that work that you might sniff at from like a South African context, but they work really well. So just, if it ain't broke, like, just let it continue.
Right. Don't. That's sort of a check your ego at the door point in a way, right?
Exactly.
If they're
Absolutely.
doing something well, but not your way,
Yeah.
respect that and don't change it. Is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
and there's there've been elements, respectively, with the two businesses that we've been able to transport across without needing to do this sort of big fully fledged integration. So that was a really interesting learning.
Hmm.
What was uh, difficult, and I think correct, that we identified as a priority, was um, having a good transition plan, having owners of that transition plan between both businesses, at different levels within both businesses, and really paying a lot of attention to how cultures fit together, personalities fit together. Um, even little things like, in Egypt, Friday's your weekend,
The weekends are different. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. And so, just things like that about how
Hmm.
you set up times and meetings, to how you engage with people, to also, some of your assumptions about your culture and, cultural superiority that either side might have, and needing to address those things. And so, was very intentional about sort of setting up work streams and forums to bring out some of
Yeah.
these things, even the more nuanced
So I
matters.
hate to use the word softer problems or softer challenges. That's maybe a dated way to describe that, but those turned out to be the biggest challenges, right? Or is that what you're saying?
Things to pay attention to, for sure. So again,
Hmm.
I think because we'd really tried to be intentional about working on those things, they I wouldn't say that they were problems, but I think the decision to
Challenges, problems,
prioritize
whatever euphemism you
was
prefer.
was was correct. Yeah, yeah, and when we say softer, it's interesting because the term softer, right? And it's a tech company, and you're right. I'd also have termed them soft issues,
Yeah,
but people are what build the business.
sure.
These are
And people
knowledge
aren't
workers
soft, at least
who,
the ones you want working for you.
yeah, it's not going to feel soft if people are unhappy, right? So
No, no,
so
that's
so,
not
so
soft
these
at
are
all.
these people being
Especially when they tell
engaged
you, right?
and
Yeah.
aligned is incredibly important.
Okay. All right. In the time we have left, I want to pivot to some broader topics. And before I realize we're gone on too long, I want to ask you about this may seem like a somewhat abrupt transition, but you're a geneticist, PhD geneticist, if I'm correct, and which bears nothing. I mean, I don't know how, if you apply that at all to what you do day to day with Sweep South. Maybe we can get to that. Um, but I'm curious. You've launched another business, and I just want to get a brief just summary from you of what it is, what it's trying to accomplish. But then the other, quite honestly, what is it like trying to scale an existing startup that's been around a few years and get another one off the where? How do you manage that? So start with what it is, and then we'll get into the softer issues around managing your life around those two things.
Yeah, so after 10 years with Sweep South, it's I think the last few years have been really um interesting for me. I think transitioning to thinking about you know what else I want to do, how else I want to spend my time. And so it's involved things like doing a bit of investing with E4E Africa, which is a VC fund that invests in underrepresented founders.
Hmm.
So turned some conversations that I was just having with other founders, and trying to provide support based on our experience to actually contributing to the funding environment on the continent. And then with Pandora, also going back to my original educational background, and looking at the link between genetics and disease from a underrepresented population standpoint specifically. So people who look like me, both as a woman and a person of color, and contributing to a better understanding of that link between genetics, disease, lifestyle and environment, family history, and using those insights to have better treatments for disease, better ways to diagnose disease, and where new therapeutics are being developed by drug companies, where they take into account more diverse populations, again, including women, because a lot of the research behind genetic diseases is done on males, it's done on white males in particular. And there are very real implications of things like hormones, body weight, your population background that can influence both treatments and also your symptoms.
Hmm.
And so
So,
very early stage, but again, looking at what I originally studied, applying some of the things that we'd used in building up Sweep South. And
what is the anticipated outcome? Is it a drug? Is it a therapy? Is it a, something? What is going to be? What is the outcome of what you're doing
so,
at Pander?
so partnerships with companies that develop diagnostics, that develop drugs,
Okay.
and really, building a novel proprietary data set that a lot of companies aren't, sort of existing companies, incumbents aren't thinking about
Yeah.
utilizing when they come up with diagnostics and treatments.
Now, is this a situation where you looked and you saw an opportunity, or you just wanted to pursue a passion? Kind of. Sometimes those aren't the same thing.
Maybe
Sometimes they overlap.
a mix of both. Maybe a mix of both. I
Uh-huh.
think again, just going back to my background, what I'd studied, thinking about what the next few years look like, and then from a Sweep South maturity point of view, we've been really intentional about putting a good team in place. The first employee is still part of the
I
company.
was going to ask that. It's like as you make this transition, you must really trust the next layer of management.
I think it's incredibly important in
Yeah.
building a long-term sustainable business, to build people around you who can take the business to the next stage. And I
Okay.
think, we spoke about ego a bit earlier on. And I also think, as founders, we can sort of get caught up in our own egos
If I don't
around.
do it, it won't get done right.
Exactly, exactly. And again, I think, how sustainable is that?
Not very. I can tell you. I think you know that already. So, okay, a couple final questions, sort of more Africa broadly. There's a lot more we could talk about. I mean, I could probably ask you about biotech all day long, or maybe not. I could. Someone could.
I'd rather
Um,
an interview round two.
fair enough. I'd love to do it. Uh, So we kind of alluded to this early in the conversation, and again, I kind of before we got on, I kind of told you I don't like to obsess over fundraising. I don't think it's necessarily the most important thing, though it is an important thing. And we've come through a year where it's been tough, not just in Africa but globally. I mean, it's just been a tough environment. Everyone I talked to who's raised
Yeah,
money either was not successful
yeah.
or described the process as something they don't ever want to go through again. It's but they probably will have to again in another year or so. Maybe the environment will be better. But just specifically from an Africa perspective, what do you think is holding the continent back, if that's the right way to frame it,
Yeah.
from drawing in more investor interest, sort of leaving aside the fact that it's been just a rough pullback in general? Kind
Yeah.
of set that aside, but just broadly speaking about Africa.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like this is another one of those things where you could have a really long conversation
Okay,
about
let's try to have a short
what
version of it, and we can come back to
happens.
it.
But I think, I think there are a few things. So I think we've got to be realistic about the size of the real size of markets on the continent. And you spoke about Nigeria, and I think there's a difference again, depending on the type of business that you're building, between a market that has a population of 200 million people, 60 million people in South Africa, whatever the numbers are, to actually going, well, what is my business, what is the addressable market for this business realistically, and what does that mean in terms of how quickly I need to be looking at other markets or adjacent business models to increase share of wallet for those customers, for example. And I
Hmm.
think that just some very real conversations that we need to have about you know particularly B2C businesses on the
Does
continent.
this tie back to the emerging markets conversation we had a moment ago? Because
Absolutely,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And I think and then the second thing is also risk, and I think the reality about even things like exchange rate risk and and currencies being devalued. And again, if you're looking at some of these currencies and where they sit today against the dollar, while we're raising dollar valuations, and the
Hmm.
return on investment that dollar-based investors are going to get, again, I think we just need to be realistic about our position on the continent, and that doesn't mean that we can't build scalable businesses. But I think it means we have to have realistic expectations and realistic strategies for high growth, scalable businesses. And then I think the second thing is also the industries that we focus on, and I think there are big opportunities to look at industries that are already um, really ripe for disruption on the continent. So resources. How do we apply technology to resources? How many businesses are building, cutting edge new tech for existing resources businesses to make them more efficient, to save costs or to increase
So you're talking
throughput?
about mining, agriculture. What are you talking about?
Absolutely. So ag tech, there's been a lot over the last few years, but mining as an example.
Hmm.
Um, and then health tech, I think again, big opportunity, but there's the reality of dealing with crumbling infrastructure, difficult administrative environments. And so the second, third maybe piece of that is also just having governments and public institutions having partners who are less sort of bogged down by red tape and this is the way things are done, and more focused on how do we help catalyze these companies to really grow, and how do we partner in building better industries,
Right.
and not sort of looking at businesses, new businesses like small fry, but rather as how could I help this business become a really big business, which will benefit all of us.
So, because when you look at Africa, you look at populations, and then you look at the composition of the population, which have large populations, large youth populations, and that your eyes can become like saucers when you look at that. Are you? I don't mean to infer what you didn't say, but are you saying that those may be not the only metrics that we should look at in Africa to sort
I
of
think we should
determine?
be looking at more metrics, but also again, if you look at a young, youth population, a big youth population, then you need to look at what are but the realities of education, unemployment.
Right.
Don't try and compete necessarily then with other countries. Look at what you have that you can leverage. So services, and outsourced services is
Mhm.
becoming a bigger and bigger industry on the continent. So again, just being realistic about where we are, what are our assets,
Okay.
and then building technology to
So
to
there's some problems that need to be solved before the potential that everyone describes can be fulfilled. Is that fair?
as with any market, right? We're just at
Sure.
different stages.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Fair enough.
yeah.
Okay, final question. Advice to your younger self. I've heard others frame the question this way. Instead of, what have you learned as an entrepreneur that you would share with other entrepreneurs? If you were talking to, I don't know what age you were when you launched the company, it's not important. You, when you were setting out on your entrepreneurial journey, what advice would you give you at that stage in your life that you didn't know at the time?
Huh. I think so. Something that comes up for me often is something that Katlego Mapai said like a good few years ago. Who's a good friend, one of the co-founders of Yoko, and
Oh, he was spoke at our first conference. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And
Mm.
so he he was just talking about this idea of the marathon and not the sprint.
Right.
And I think especially as a young founder, kind of getting caught up in everything that you want to happen in the next year, 2 years, 3 years, and rather thinking about how do I build a properly sustainable business, and then build back from that, and then think about what are the key things that I need to do this year, next year, the year after. And I think that for me, could have avoided a lot of anxiety and stress. I think it would have probably helped us grow faster. Knowing what risks we can take and what risks we shouldn't. The sort of the Jeff Bezos decision making. Um, the sort of the criteria he uses for making the irreversible and reversible
Right.
decisions. And then I think another one that's been big for me is having whether it's mentors, advisors, but people who've done this before. And I think yeah, I just felt like I need to kind of figure everything out myself, and again, I think would have avoided a lot of pain and angst
Yeah.
if I'd
Probably every
consult.
founder's problem is a problem someone else has solved already somewhere else.
Exactly, and so either an advisor or mentor or someone, other founders, which I think we have done pretty well, to sort of build up a network of other founders who've gone through similar challenges.
You mentioned Kalego. Do you have other mentors that you care to mention?
There have been many people who've just been incredible, sources of support, advice. So again, Katlejo's been great, Lungi's been great, Pule Tokobong, who was with CREVC. Um, Vinny Lingham was one of our earliest investors, who's been a big
I
supporter.
know Vinny. I've had him on the podcast.
He's been great.
Yeah.
Polo Leteka from IDF, and then Alethea IDF, also been early stage supporter, who's sort of continued to support 10 years on. And then they're just the tech and startup ecosystem in general has been super supportive, and I think that's one of the best things about the industry, not just in South Africa and Africa, but I think globally. It's just people who are optimistic by nature and excited about building and innovation tend to just be open and supportive and champions of other people who are the same, because sometimes it's a really difficult attitude to maintain. with all of the horrible, difficult things that are happening in the world, it's easy to be pessimistic and down on everything and criticize everyone else. And so I think when you find people who optimistic and who focus on building, people are excited about that. And I think, again, it's one of the best things about being being a startup, being in the startup industry, engaging with other people who dreamers.
Fantastic. I think that's a great point to end it on. Aisha, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thanks again, Charles.
It's been a great pleasure. All right. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Summit Speaker Series. Stay tuned for more episodes featuring speakers at the upcoming BigFive Summit, 19th, 20th March in Cape Town. To learn about participating in the summit, write to us at info@bigfivedigital.org. That's info@bigfivedigital.org. Thanks, and see you next time.